The morning sun cast long shadows across Naval Base Artemis as Staff Sergeant Dylan Torres spotted what he assumed was a lost recruit wandering near the restricted command sector. The young woman looked barely old enough to be out of basic training, her uniform crisp but unfamiliar, her movements uncertain as she studied the base layout on her phone. Torres had seen 1,000 rookies like her, green and confused, needing to be put in their place before they caused problems. He strode toward her, his voice sharp with authority, ready to deliver the kind of dressing down that would teach this kid how things worked around here. What Torres didn't know was that this wasn't just any rookie, and in the next 60 seconds, his entire career was about to change forever. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. Staff Sergeant Dylan Torres had served at Naval Base Artemis for 12 years, and in that time, he developed what he considered a finely tuned radar for trouble. New recruits were always trouble, wandering into restricted areas, asking stupid questions, disrupting the carefully maintained order that kept a military installation running smoothly. This Tuesday morning, under a bright April sun that made the Mediterranean coastline sparkle beyond the base perimeter, his radar was pinging loud and clear. The young woman stood near the entrance to the command building, phone in hand, looking around with an expression Torres had seen countless times before. Confusion mixed with determination, the face of someone who was lost but too proud to ask for directions. She couldn't have been more than 25, maybe younger, with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun that somehow still managed to look civilian. Her uniform was immaculate, he'd give her that, but something about it seemed off. The cut was standard issue, but it fit too well, too professionally tailored. Most recruits wore uniforms that looked like they'd been issued from a warehouse bin. Torres adjusted his cover and marched toward her, his boots striking the pavement with the kind of deliberate rhythm that announced authority. He'd given this speech so many times he could deliver it in his sleep. Establish dominance, cite regulations, redirect the lost lamb back to wherever they were supposed to be, and get back to his actual duties. Simple, efficient, and necessary. "Excuse me," he called out when he was still 10 feet away, his voice carrying the sharp edge of command. "This is a restricted area. What unit are you with?" The young woman looked up from her phone, and for just a moment, Torres caught something in her expression. Not fear or embarrassment, but something closer to amusement. It was gone so quickly he thought he might have imagined it. "I'm sorry," she said, her accent unmistakably European, British perhaps, or educated somewhere in that direction. Her voice was softer than he expected, almost gentle, but there was a steadiness underneath it that should have been his first warning. "I asked what unit you're with," Torres repeated, closing the distance between them. "Because unless you have clearance for this sector, you need to turn around and head back to wherever you came from. This building is command personnel only." The woman tilted her head slightly, studying him with eyes that were an unusual shade of gray-green, like the sea before a storm. "I see. And you are?" The question threw Torres off balance for just a second. Recruits didn't ask staff sergeants who they were. They stammered apologies and scurried away. "Staff Sergeant Dylan Torres, Base Security Operations. Now, I'm going to need to see your identification and your authorization for being in this sector." "Authorization," the woman repeated, and again that hint of amusement flickered across her features. She reached into her jacket pocket, and Torres tensed instinctively, though he had no long reason to expect trouble. When her hand emerged, it held a standard military ID card, which she extended toward him. Torres took the card, expecting to see the designation of some junior enlisted personnel, maybe even a contractor who'd gotten lost on her first day. Instead, what he saw made his brain stutter like a scratched record. The card was genuine, the holographic security features were current, but the rank designation couldn't possibly be correct. Admiral, Rear Admiral, upper half, Irene Hill. Torres looked from the card to the woman and back again, his mind struggling to process information that didn't match his expectations. This couldn't be right. Admirals didn't wander around alone studying base maps on their phones. Admirals didn't look like they were barely old enough to rent a car. And admirals certainly didn't dress like this, perfectly tailored but somehow understated version of a naval uniform. "This is a joke," Torres said. though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "Where'd you get this?" "Because impersonating an officer is a serious offense, and I don't care how realistic your fake ID looks." The woman, Irene Hill, if the card was to be believed, didn't look offended. Instead, she looked almost sad, as if she'd seen this reaction before and had hoped not to see it again. "It's not a fake, Sergeant Torres. I'm Rear Admiral Irene Hill, and I arrived on base approximately 30 minutes ago. I was actually trying to find the command building when you approached me, so in a way, your timing was excellent." Torres felt heat rising in his face. This had to be some kind of test, or a prank, or possibly a very elaborate case of stolen valor. He'd heard about people who dressed up in military uniforms and pretended to be what they weren't, looking for respect or discounts or God knows what else. But this woman seemed so calm, so utterly unbothered by his accusations, that doubt began creeping in around the edges of his certainty. "Ma'am," he said, putting as much skeptical emphasis on the word as he dared, "with all due respect, if you were actually an admiral, you'd have an escort. You'd have people carrying your bags. You'd have an entire welcoming committee. You wouldn't be standing here alone looking at Google Maps trying to find the command building." Irene Hill's expression shifted then, and Torres saw something harder beneath the gentle exterior. Steel wrapped in silk. "With all due respect, Sergeant, I prefer to get the lay of the land on my own terms, before I'm surrounded by handlers and protocol officers. I find that people behave more naturally when they don't know they're being observed by senior command. It gives me a much better sense of how a base actually operates versus how it performs during official inspections." The logic was sound, uncomfortably sound, but Torres wasn't ready to back down. 12 years of service had taught him that the chain of command existed for a reason, and part of maintaining security meant questioning things that didn't add up, even when, especially when, those things came with Admiral stars attached. "I'm going to need to verify this," Torres said, pulling out his radio. "Base security, this is Torres. I need confirmation on the identity of a Rear Admiral Irene Hill. Supposed to have arrived on base this morning." There was a pause that seemed to stretch forever, filled with nothing but static and the distant sound of seabirds crying over the Mediterranean. Then the radio crackled to life, and Command Master Chief Patricia Brennan's voice came through, tight with barely controlled stress. "Torres, where are you right now?" "Command building entrance, Chief. I've got someone here claiming to be, is she about 5'6", dark hair, British accent, and looking at you like she's trying to decide whether you're brave or stupid." Torres looked at Irene Hill, who had her eyebrows slightly raised in an expression that definitely matched Brennan's description. Affirmative, Chief." "Then congratulations, Torres. You just confronted our new base commander. Admiral Hill's been on site for 45 minutes, and she specifically requested no formal reception so she could observe normal base operations. You might want to apologize." Immediately, the radio went silent, but the words continued echoing in Torres's head like alarm bells. Base commander. The woman standing in front of him, who he'd just accused of carrying a fake ID and threatened to report for impersonating an officer, was his new commanding officer. Not just an admiral passing through, not just some visiting dignitary, the person who would control every aspect of operations at Naval Base Artemis for the foreseeable future. Torres felt his stomach drop somewhere into the vicinity of his boots. In 12 years of service, he'd made mistakes. Everyone did, but nothing quite like this. He'd questioned superior officers before, sure, but only when proper. Protocol demanded it, and never, ever had he accused one of being a fraud. Torres started, then stopped, unsure how to even begin an apology adequate to the situation. Every phrase that came to mind sounded either too casual or too obsequious. His mouth opened and closed uselessly, and he was suddenly, painfully aware that he was probably providing Admiral Hill with an excellent impression of a confused fish. Irene Hill watched this internal struggle play out on his face, and to Torres' surprise, her expression softened. She stepped closer, lowering her voice so that their conversation wouldn't carry to the handful of personnel who had started to gather nearby. Drawn by the sight of a staff sergeant apparently harassing a young woman near the command building. "Sergeant Torres," she said quietly, and her tone wasn't angry or condescending. If anything, it sounded almost kind. "Take a breath. You were doing your job, and you were doing it well. You saw someone who looked out of place in a restricted area, and you questioned them. That's exactly what you're supposed to do. The fact that I happen to be an admiral doesn't change the appropriateness of your initial approach. But I accused you of carrying fake identification, Torres said, his voice barely above a whisper. I threatened to report you. I essentially called you a liar. Yes, you did, Irene agreed, and now there was definitely a hint of amusement in her eyes. And if I had actually been someone trying to infiltrate this base with forged credentials, your response would have been exemplary. You didn't accept my claims at face value. You demanded verification. That's good security practice, regardless of what rank insignia someone is wearing. Torres wanted to feel relieved, but the situation was too surreal. He'd never heard of a senior officer being this understanding about being confronted by enlisted personnel. Most admirals he'd encountered, admittedly from a significant distance, had egos that couldn't tolerate even minor challenges to their authority. Yet here was Admiral Hill, who by all rights should be furious, instead acting like he'd passed some kind of test. However, Irene continued, and her tone shifted slightly, becoming more formal. There is a lesson here that I think is worth discussing. When you looked at me, what did you see? The question caught Torres off guard. He glanced at her again, really looking this time rather than just cataloging her as a problem to be solved. Young woman, professionally dressed, alone, appearing uncertain. It was the profile of someone lost, someone who needed direction, someone who couldn't possibly be important. I saw someone who looked out of place, Torres said carefully. Someone who appeared to be a junior, enlisted, or possibly a civilian contractor on her first day. And why did I look out of place? Irene asked. Be specific. Torres hesitated, sensing a trap but unable to see where it might be. You were alone. You were checking your phone for directions. Your uniform, while correct, seemed too well fitted to be standard issue. You looked. He paused, searching for a diplomatic way to phrase it. Young for your apparent rank. Young, Irene repeated, and something in her voice suggested she'd heard this particular observation many times before. Sergeant Torres, I'm 32 years old. I graduated from the Royal Naval College at 21, served on 4 different vessels across 3 theaters of operation, completed my master's degree in strategic operations while deployed, and spent the last 3 years at Naval Command working on fleet modernization initiatives. I've earned every rank I've held through merit, performance, and dedication to service. CTA AT 1,500 words. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. Torres felt, his face burning with embarrassment. She wasn't criticizing him, exactly, but every word felt like a gentle indictment of his assumptions. He looked at her and seen someone young and female and therefore junior, someone who couldn't possibly have authority, someone who needed to be redirected rather than respected. I apologize, Admiral, Torres said, and this time his voice carried genuine contrition rather than just the automatic deference of rank. I made assumptions based on appearance rather than following proper verification protocols. It won't happen again. Actually, Irene said, and now she did smile, expression that transformed her face from serious to something warmer, more approachable. I'm counting on it happening again, just not to me specifically. This base has security protocols for a reason, and I want every person serving here to enforce those protocols, regardless of who they're dealing with. If someone looks out of place, question them. If something doesn't feel right, investigate it. Don't let rank or appearance or fear of offending someone important prevent you from doing your job properly. She handed him back his radio, which he realized he'd been clutching so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. What I do want to change, however, is the assumption that young or female automatically equals junior or incompetent. That's a habit I've encountered at every installation I've served at, and it's one I intend to address here at Artemis. Torres nodded, understanding that he was being given both a reprieve and a warning. Admiral Hill wasn't going to punish him for this encounter, but she was making it clear that the assumptions underlying his mistake weren't acceptable going forward. I understand, ma'am, he said. And for what it's worth, you're right. I did assume that you couldn't possibly be senior command based on your appearance. That was wrong of me, and I'll work on correcting that bias. I appreciate that, Sergeant, Irene said. Now, since you're base security operations, perhaps you could escort me to the command building? I'd like to hear your assessment of our current security posture as we walk. Specifically, I'm interested in your thoughts on access control in the restricted sectors. Torres felt the whiplash of emotional shifts, from authority to embarrassment to relief, and now to professional consultation. Admiral Hill was treating him like a valuable resource rather than a problem to be dealt with, and he wasn't quite sure how to process that. Of course, ma'am, he said, falling into step beside her as they walked toward the command building entrance. Our current access control system uses a combination of card readers and biometric scanners for restricted areas. We've got good coverage on the main facilities, but there are some gaps in the peripheral buildings that concern me. As Torres talked, explaining the security infrastructure with the detailed knowledge of someone who'd worked with it for over a decade, he watched Admiral Hill process the information. She asked sharp questions, made notes on her phone, and demonstrated a working knowledge of security protocols that surprised him. This wasn't just a senior officer nodding along politely to enlisted expertise. This was someone who actually understood the technical aspects of what he was describing. They were halfway to the command building entrance when Command Master Chief Brennan appeared, moving at a pace just short of running. She was a tall woman in her mid-40s, her uniform immaculate, and her expression hovering somewhere between relief and residual panic. "Admiral Hill," Brennan said, slightly out of breath. "My sincere apologies for the confusion this morning. We were expecting your arrival via the main gate with proper escort, and when you didn't appear, I came through the auxiliary entrance," Irene explained. "I wanted to see how visitor processing worked without any special accommodations. I'm pleased to report that your gate guards were professional and thorough, though I did notice some inefficiencies in the badge issuance process that we should address." Brennan's expression suggested she wasn't sure whether to be pleased about the professional rating or worried about the identified inefficiencies. She glanced at Torres, and he could see her mentally calculating how much trouble he was in. "Sergeant Torres has been very helpful," Irene continued, apparently reading Brennan's concern. "He properly challenged my presence in a restricted area and followed appropriate verification protocols. Exactly the kind of vigilance I want to see from base security personnel." The relief on Brennan's face was palpable, though Torres suspected he'd still be receiving a private conversation about the incident later. For now, though, it seemed he'd avoided the worst possible consequences of his mistake. The command building's interior was exactly what Irene had expected. Polished floors that reflected the fluorescent lighting, walls lined with photographs of previous base commanders dating back decades, and a palpable sense of hierarchy that seemed to thicken the air itself. Officers moved with purposeful strides while enlisted personnel pressed themselves against walls to let their superiors pass. It was the same dynamic she'd observed at every installation she'd served, a careful dance of deference and authority that sometimes served the mission and sometimes simply served itself. Command Master Chief Brennan led them through the main corridor toward the Admiral's suite, maintaining a steady stream of briefing information as they walked. Squadron readiness reports, ongoing maintenance schedules, personnel statistics, all delivered with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd given this presentation multiple times to multiple commanders. Irene listened carefully, but she was also watching the reactions of personnel they passed. Some barely glanced up, absorbed in their duties. Others did double takes, clearly wondering who the young woman in the tailored uniform might be. "The change of command ceremony is scheduled for 1400 hours on Thursday," Brennan was saying. "We've arranged for the full honor guard, invited dignitaries from the local government, and coordinated with public affairs for media coverage. Admiral Garrett, your predecessor, will officially transfer command during the ceremony." "Actually," Irene said, causing Brennan to pause mid-stride, "I'd like to postpone the ceremony by 1 week." Brennan's professional composure flickered for just a moment. "Ma'am, the invitations have been sent, the arrangements are made, and Admiral Garrett has already begun his transition briefings with his next assignment. Postponing would create significant complications." "I understand," Irene replied, her tone sympathetic but firm. However, I don't want my first week as base commander to be consumed by ceremonial obligations. I need time to observe operations, meet with department heads individually, and understand the actual state of affairs here at Artemis. The ceremony can wait until I have a proper grasp of what I'm actually taking command of. They'd reached the Admiral's suite now, an impressive set of offices that overlooked the base's main operational area. Through the large windows, Irene could see the harbor where 3 destroyers sat at their moorings, their gray hulls stark against the blue Mediterranean water. It was a commanding view, literally and figuratively, the kind of office designed to remind its occupant of the weight of responsibility they carried. Torres, who had remained silent during the walk, stepped back to take his leave, but Irene gestured for him to stay. "Sergeant Torres, I'd like your honest assessment of something. In your 12 years here, how often has a new base commander spent their first week observing normal operations before taking official command?" Torres glanced at Brennan, clearly uncomfortable being asked to comment on command decisions, but Irene's expectant expression made it clear she wanted an answer. "Never, ma'am," he said finally. "Usually the new commander arrives, there's a ceremony within 48 hours, and then they settle into their routine. Most observation happens during official briefings and scheduled tours, which means everyone has time to prepare, to polish, to present the version of reality they want the new commander to see," Irene said. It wasn't a question. "Chief Brennan, I appreciate the work that's gone into planning the ceremony, and we will absolutely have it. Just not yet. Use the delay to inform Admiral Garrett and the invitees. Frame it as an operational necessity if that makes the explanation easier." Brennan's expression was carefully neutral, but Irene could read the concern underneath. A base commander who deviated from established protocol before even officially taking command was a base commander who might deviate in other, more significant ways. It was a reputation Irene had earned at her previous assignments and one she'd learned to wear comfortably. "Of course, ma'am," Brennan said. "I'll make the necessary arrangements. Is there anything else you need for your first day?" "Yes," Irene said, moving to the window and looking out at the base spread below her. "I want a complete schedule of normal operations for the next week, not special briefings or prepared presentations. I want to know when shifts change, when training exercises happen, when maintenance crews work. I'll be observing all of it, unannounced and without escort when possible." By late afternoon, word had spread through Naval Base Artemis like wildfire through dry brush. The new admiral was not only younger than anyone expected, but she'd also arrived unannounced, been challenged by base security, and immediately postponed her own change of command ceremony. The reaction among the base personnel ranged from curiosity to concern to outright skepticism. Lieutenant Commander James Rutherford heard about the morning's events while reviewing maintenance reports in the engineering department offices. His deputy, Lieutenant Sarah Kim, brought him the news with barely concealed amusement. "So Torres actually accused her of carrying fake ID?" Kim asked, perching on the edge of Rutherford's desk. I would have paid money to see that conversation. Rutherford didn't share her amusement. He was a practical man who'd spent 18 years in the Navy working his way up from enlisted ranks, and he developed a deep distrust of command officers who disrupted established routines. "What I'm hearing," he said, setting down his tablet, "is that we've got a new CO who thinks protocols don't apply to her. Arriving without proper escort, wandering around restricted areas, postponing official ceremonies. That's not unconventional leadership. That's disrespect for the chain of command. Or maybe she's just trying to get an honest look at how things actually work," Kim suggested. "You've said yourself that every time we get a new commander, we spend weeks preparing dog and pony shows instead of doing our actual jobs. There's a difference between streamlining transitions and ignoring protocol entirely," Rutherford countered. "And from what I'm hearing, Admiral Hill is 32 years old. You know what I was doing at 32? I was a junior lieutenant learning how to manage a single department. Now we're supposed to trust someone barely older than that to command an entire base?" Kim's expression cooled. "With respect, sir, she didn't get to Admiral by being unqualified. Maybe we should wait to form opinions until we've actually met her." But Rutherford's concerns weren't unique. In the petty officer's mess, Chief Petty Officer Raymond Walsh was expressing similar doubts to a table of colleagues. Walsh had 25 years of service, had worked under 8 different base commanders, and considered himself an expert on what made command leadership effective. "Mark my words," Walsh said, jabbing his fork at his lunch for emphasis, "this is going to be a disaster. You can't put someone that young, that inexperienced, in charge of an installation this size and expect things to run smoothly. I don't care what her credentials say. Maybe she's got credentials we don't know about," suggested Petty Officer First Class Jennifer Martinez, though her tone was uncertain. "They wouldn't make her an admiral if she wasn't qualified." "Qualified on paper, maybe," Walsh replied. "But there's qualified and then there's ready. You need years of experience, real experience, before you can handle the complexity of running a place like Artemis. This feels like some kind of political appointment, checking boxes rather than choosing the best person for the job." The skepticism wasn't universal. In the communication center, several junior officers were discussing the morning's events with something approaching hope. Ensign David Foster, who joined the base only 3 months earlier, saw Admiral Hill's unconventional arrival as potentially positive. "Maybe having someone younger in command means someone who actually understands how things work now," he said to his shift partner. "Every commander we've had has been at least 50, treating technology like it's some kind of mysterious magic rather than just tools we use every day." But even the optimistic voices were outnumbered by doubt. The general consensus forming across Naval Base Artemis was that their new commander was either dangerously incompetent or dangerously unconventional, and neither option inspired confidence. By the time evening arrived, bringing cooler air off the Mediterranean, Irene Hill had become the subject of dozens of conversations, most of which reached unflattering conclusions about her capabilities. Irene herself was aware of these conversations, at least in general terms. She'd seen the skeptical looks, heard the whispered comments that people thought were quieter than they actually were. It was familiar territory. At every previous assignment, she'd faced the same initial resistance, the same assumption that her rank was somehow unearned or inappropriate. The difference now was the scale. As a base commander, every decision she made would be scrutinized. Every unconventional choice would be evidence of her supposed unfitness for command. She stood in her temporary quarters that evening, reviewing the operational reports that Brennan had provided, and allowed herself a moment of honest acknowledgement. This was going to be harder than her previous assignments. The skepticism was deeper, the stakes higher, and the margin for error smaller. But she'd known that when she accepted the position, breaking through assumptions and proving capability through action was something she'd become very good at over the years. The following morning began at 05:30 when Irene arrived at the base gymnasium, dressed in standard PT gear and ready for the regular morning physical training session. The gym was already occupied by early risers, mostly junior enlisted personnel, going through their workout routines before their shifts began. Their conversations died away as they noticed her, replaced by curious glances and whispered speculation. Irene headed for the pull-up bars, a deliberate choice. She'd learned years ago that physical credibility mattered in military culture, especially for women and especially for officers who looked younger than their rank suggested. She began her routine, the same one she'd maintained for years, methodical and demanding. Around her, personnel tried not to stare while absolutely staring. 50, counted a voice nearby as Irene completed her set. She dropped from the bar and turned to find Torres, also in PT gear, watching with an expression of reassessment. "That's impressive, ma'am. Most officers top out at 20. Most officers don't face constant questions about their physical capability," Irene replied, moving to the weight bench. "I learned early that meeting standards wasn't enough. I had to exceed them consistently just to be taken seriously." Torres began his own workout nearby, and after a moment of hesitation asked, "Does it get easier?" "The skepticism, I mean. Once people see what you can do?" "Sometimes," Irene said, adjusting the weights. "But there's always a new audience, a new group who needs convincing. That's why I don't rely on physical performance alone. Competence has to be demonstrated across every dimension of leadership, not just the ones that make people comfortable." By 0700, Irene was showered, changed, and walking through the base's maintenance facilities unannounced and unescorted. She found Lieutenant Commander Rutherford in the main workshop, reviewing a repair schedule with his team. His expression, when he noticed her, was carefully neutral, but she could read the wariness underneath. "Admiral Hill," Rutherford said, straightening. "We weren't expecting a visit this morning." "I know," Irene replied. "That's intentional. I'm more interested in seeing normal operations than prepared presentations. Tell me about what you're working on." Rutherford's briefing was professional but perfunctory, hitting the main points without the depth or nuance that Irene knew existed in complex maintenance operations. She let him finish, then asked, "And what are the problems you're not mentioning? The resource shortages, the equipment failures, the workarounds your team has developed because official channels are too slow?" The question clearly caught Rutherford off guard. He exchanged glances with Lieutenant Kim, who was watching the exchange with interest. "Ma'am, I'm not sure what you mean." "Commander, I've reviewed enough maintenance reports to know the difference between official documentation and operational reality," Irene said. "Every facility has gaps between what the paperwork says and what's actually happening. I'm not here to assign blame. I'm here to understand the real situation so I can help fix it." Kim spoke up before Rutherford could respond. "We've got a persistent hydraulic system issue on 2 of the destroyers. The official parts keep failing because they're not actually rated for the stress levels we're putting them under. We've been using modified civilian components as a temporary solution, but that's technically against procurement regulations." Rutherford shot Kim a warning look, but Irene was already nodding. "Because the procurement system hasn't caught up with the actual performance requirements of modern vessels. I've seen this problem at 3 different installations. Show me the documentation on the failures and the workaround specs. If your solution is effective, we should be getting it officially approved rather than forcing you to operate in a gray area." The atmosphere in the workshop shifted subtly. Personnel who'd been pretending not to listen while absolutely listening began paying more open attention. This wasn't the response they'd expected from a new commander, especially one they'd already written off as inexperienced. Rutherford's professional reserve cracked slightly. Most commanders don't want to hear about regulations we're bending, even when the bending is necessary to keep ships operational. Most commanders are more concerned with looking good on inspection reports than with actual operational effectiveness. Irene replied, "I'm not most commanders. If your team has developed a better solution, I want to know about it so we can make it official policy rather than an unofficial workaround." Word of Admiral Hill's maintenance facility visit spread quickly, adding new dimensions to the base's ongoing conversation about their new commander. The skeptics saw it as inexperience, a junior officer trying too hard to be relatable. The optimists saw it as refreshing engagement with real operational issues. The realists, like Chief Petty Officer Walsh, remained unconvinced. "One visit doesn't prove anything," Walsh said during the lunch break, holding court at his usual table in the mess. "Anyone can walk through a facility and ask seemingly intelligent questions. Real leadership shows up over months and years, not in carefully staged morning visits." But as the week progressed, Irene's visits continued across every department on base. She observed the communications center during a night shift, sat in on a routine training brief for new security personnel, and spent an entire afternoon in the supply depot understanding the logistics of parts management. Each visit followed the same pattern: arrive unannounced, ask detailed questions that demonstrated actual knowledge rather than superficial curiosity, and focus on problems rather than praise. By Thursday, when the originally scheduled change of command ceremony would have taken place, personnel throughout the base were beginning to reassess their initial judgments. Lieutenant Commander Rutherford found himself in the unexpected position of defending Admiral Hill during a department head meeting. "Say what you will about her methods," Rutherford told his colleagues, but she identified 3 critical maintenance issues in 20 minutes that our previous commander never acknowledged in 2 years. That's either exceptional luck or exceptional competence, and I'm not betting on luck. The real test came on Friday morning when a routine training exercise in the harbor went wrong. One of the destroyers experienced a complete power failure during maneuvering drills, leaving it dead in the water and drifting toward the harbor's shallow northern edge. The situation wasn't immediately dangerous, but it required swift coordination between multiple departments to prevent potential grounding. Irene was in the command center when the emergency call came. Through observing normal operations as she'd done all week. Command Master Chief Brennan immediately began coordinating response, but Irene noticed something in the communication patterns that seemed inefficient. "Chief," Irene said quietly, "why are we routing communications through 3 different channels? Engineering should be talking directly to the vessel's damage control team, not passing information through the operations center and back out." Brennan hesitated, clearly torn between following established protocol and accepting the suggestion. "Ma'am, that's how Admiral Garrett preferred emergency communication structured. He wanted all information flowing through a central point, which adds delay and increases the chance of miscommunication," Irene replied. She stepped forward to the communication station. "Patch me through to the destroyer's damage control chief directly." What followed was 15 minutes of precise coordination that had personnel throughout the command center watching with growing respect. Irene's questions were specific and technical, demonstrating detailed knowledge of the vessel's systems. Her instructions were clear and prioritized correctly. When she authorized the use of Rutherford's unofficial hydraulic workaround to restore partial power, she did so with full understanding of the risks and alternatives. The destroyer was secured and safely moored within 30 minutes, a resolution that typically took twice as long under previous command structures. As the emergency wound down and normal operations resumed, Irene turned to find the command center staff watching her with expressions that had shifted from skepticism to something approaching respect. Torres, who'd been monitoring security aspects of the emergency, stepped forward. "Ma'am, that was exceptional crisis management. That was basic operational coordination," Irene replied, but she allowed herself a slight smile. "Though I appreciate that it might have looked exceptional compared to more bureaucratic approaches. Sometimes the best leadership is just removing obstacles and letting competent people do their jobs." The weekend brought a temporary lull in operations, but for Irene, it meant an opportunity to address something that had been bothering her since her arrival. She'd noticed patterns in how personnel interacted with each other, subtle hierarchies that went beyond official rank structure. Certain voices were consistently given more weight in discussions, while others were dismissed or overlooked entirely. The patterns weren't random, and they weren't based solely on competence. Monday morning, Irene called a meeting of all department heads in the main conference room. The assembled officers filed in with varying degrees of curiosity and concern. Unscheduled senior staff meetings usually meant either commendations or problems, and given Admiral Hill's unconventional first week, most were betting on the latter. "Thank you all for coming," Irene began, standing at the head of the long conference table, rather than sitting in the commander's chair. "I've spent the past week observing operations across this base, and I've identified several areas where we can improve effectiveness. But before we discuss operational matters, I want to address something more fundamental about how we function as a command team." Lieutenant Commander Rutherford shifted in his seat, exchanging glances with the officer beside him. "Here it comes," his expression seemed to say. The idealistic speech about teamwork and cooperation that would sound good but change nothing. "I've noticed that certain personnel consistently have their suggestions dismissed or minimized during briefings and planning sessions," Irene continued. "Not because their ideas lack merit, but because of assumptions about their experience, their age, or their background. I've watched junior officers with innovative solutions be talked over by senior personnel offering conventional approaches. I've seen enlisted specialists with deep technical knowledge be excluded from discussions where their expertise would be invaluable." She paused, letting her words settle over the room. Several officers looked uncomfortable, perhaps recognizing their own behavior in her description. "This isn't a moral failing or a character flaw," Irene said. "It's a cognitive bias that exists in every organization, military or civilian. We tend to value inputs based on their source rather than their content. We give more weight to people who look like what we think leaders should look like, who have traditional career trajectories, who fit our mental models of competence." Commander Victoria Pierce, the base's operations officer and one of only 3 women at the senior staff level, spoke up. "With respect, Admiral, these dynamics have existed in military culture for decades. One briefing isn't going to change institutional patterns." "You're absolutely right," Irene agreed. "Which is why I'm not giving a briefing. I'm implementing a new protocol for all planning sessions and strategic discussions, effective immediately." When we're evaluating proposals or solutions, we'll use a modified Delphi method. Ideas will be presented without attribution, evaluated on merit, and only after we've reached preliminary conclusions will we discuss who proposed what. The room erupted in murmurs. Lieutenant Commander Harris, who oversaw logistics, raised his hand. "Ma'am, that seems overly complicated for routine operations. It'll slow down our decision-making process significantly." "It will slow it initially," Irene acknowledged, "but I'd rather make slower, better decisions than fast, biased ones. And I suspect once we adjust to the new process, we'll find that it actually improves efficiency by reducing time wasted on status posturing and territorial disputes." She pulled up a presentation on the main screen, showing data from her previous assignment where she'd implemented similar protocols. At Naval Station Brighton, this approach increased operational efficiency by 18% over 6 months. We identified solutions from junior personnel that senior staff had overlooked, and we reduced the number of planning iterations needed because we weren't fighting about whose idea was whose. Chief Petty Officer Walsh, who'd been invited to the meeting specifically at Irene's request, cleared his throat. "Admiral, with respect, Brighton is a smaller installation with different operational requirements. What works there might not translate to Artemis." "Another excellent point," Irene said, and Walsh looked surprised that his challenge was being received positively. "Which is why I'm not dictating exactly how this will work. I want each department to adapt the core concept to their specific needs. Commander Pierce, you'll coordinate implementation across departments and report back in 2 weeks on what's working and what needs adjustment." The meeting continued for another hour, with Irene walking through her observations from the previous week and her preliminary recommendations for operational improvements. She praised what was working well, identified gaps without assigning blame, and made it clear that she expected honest feedback about her own leadership approach. As the officers filed out, Rutherford found himself walking beside Commander Pierce. "What do you think?" he asked quietly. Pierce was silent for a moment before responding. "I think we've spent the last week assuming she was too young and inexperienced to command this base effectively. I'm starting to wonder if we were really just uncomfortable with someone who doesn't lead the way we're used to being led." The implementation of Admiral Hill's new protocols didn't go smoothly at first. Department heads struggled with the unfamiliar process of evaluating ideas without knowing their source. Junior personnel were hesitant to contribute, convinced their suggestions would be dismissed regardless of the new system. And skeptics like Walsh remained vocally unconvinced that the changes would produce meaningful improvements. The real test came during a Wednesday afternoon planning session for an upcoming joint training exercise with Allied naval forces. The session involved coordination between multiple departments, complex logistics, and significant resource allocation. Under the old system, such meetings typically lasted 3 to 4 hours and involved considerable debate about whose priorities took precedence. Commander Pierce ran the meeting using the new protocol. Proposals for the exercise structure were submitted anonymously in advance. The group evaluated each option based on specified criteria: operational value, resource efficiency, training objectives met, and risk management. Only after preliminary rankings were established did Pierce reveal the source of each proposal. The top-ranked solution, which emphasized integrated training scenarios over traditional sequential exercises, had come from Lieutenant Sarah Kim, Rutherford's deputy. Her approach would save 2 days of preparation time and provide more realistic training conditions. Under the old system, her proposal had been briefly mentioned and then set aside in favor of more conventional approaches from senior officers. "I'll be damned," Rutherford muttered, looking at the evaluation results. "I dismissed this when Kim first mentioned it because I thought it was too ambitious. But looking at the details without that bias is clearly the best option." The meeting ended 90 minutes after it began, a full hour and a half faster than typical planning sessions. More importantly, the decision had been reached with genuine consensus rather than grudging acceptance of the senior-most officer's preference. Word of the successful planning session spread, and, gradually, resistance to Admiral Hill's methods began softening. But there were still holdouts Personnel who saw the changes as unnecessary complications imposed by a commander trying to prove she was different rather than effective. Chief Walsh remained among the most vocal critics. During an evening gathering at the base recreation center, he held forth on his concerns to a group of senior enlisted personnel. "Look, I'm not saying Admiral Hill is incompetent," Walsh said, nursing a soft drink. "But all these changes, all this new process and protocol, it's a solution, looking for a problem. We've been running operations successfully for years. Why fix what isn't broken?" Petty Officer Martinez, who'd been listening quietly, finally spoke up. "Chief, with respect, maybe it was broken and we just got used to it. I've watched 3 good ideas from junior personnel get ignored in the last month alone, simply because they came from the wrong people. If Admiral Hill's process fixes that, isn't it worth the adjustment period?" Walsh's expression soured. "Martinez, you've been here. What, 18 months? I've got 25 years of experience telling me how naval operations worked. Sometimes traditions exist for good reasons, and sometimes," came a new voice from the doorway, "traditions exist simply because no one's questioned them recently." The group turned to find Admiral Hill standing at the entrance to the recreation area, still in uniform though it was after duty hours. Walsh straightened instinctively, his criticism dying in his throat. "Chief Walsh," Irene said, walking over to the group, "I've been hoping to have a conversation with you. I understand you have concerns about the changes I've been implementing." Walsh glanced at his colleagues, clearly uncomfortable having his criticisms addressed directly by the person they'd been directed at. "Ma'am, I was just expressing some reservations about the pace of change. You were expressing legitimate concerns about whether my methods are actually improving operations or just making them different," Irene corrected gently. "And those are concerns I want to hear. Chief, you have more experience at this base than I have in the Navy, total. Your perspective is valuable, and I'd be foolish to ignore it." She pulled up a chair, an informal gesture that seemed to catch everyone off guard. "Tell me specifically what you think isn't working. Not in general terms, but concrete examples where the new protocols are causing problems rather than solving them." Walsh hesitated, clearly wrestling with military deference and his genuine concerns. Finally, he said, "The anonymized proposal system works for planning sessions, but it's created confusion in daily operations. Junior personnel are now hesitant to speak up in real-time situations because they're waiting for some formal process instead of just communicating directly." "That's an excellent point," Irene said, and the surprise on Walsh's face was evident. The protocol was designed for strategic planning and resource allocation, not for operational communications. If people are applying it too broadly, that's a failure in how I explained the implementation. What would you suggest as a clarification?" The conversation that followed lasted nearly an hour. Walsh, initially defensive, gradually opened up with specific observations about where the new systems were working and where they were creating unintended complications. Irene listened carefully, took notes, and asked clarifying questions. Other personnel in the recreation area slowly drew closer, adding their own observations to the discussion. By the end, Walsh's expression had shifted from defensive skepticism to something approaching collaboration. "I still think some of these changes are unnecessary," he said finally. "But I appreciate that you're willing to listen to feedback and adjust rather than just enforcing your vision regardless of how it's working in practice. Chief, if I'm not willing to be wrong and learn from people with more experience, then I have no business commanding this base," Irene replied. The change of command ceremony finally took place on a bright Thursday morning, 2 weeks after Irene's arrival. The delay had given personnel time to form opinions based on observation rather than assumption, and the atmosphere was markedly different from what it would have been during that first week. The parade ground was filled with personnel in dress uniforms, visiting dignitaries from Allied naval commands, and local government officials who maintained relationships with the base. Admiral David Garrett, the outgoing commander, stood beside Irene as they prepared for the formal transfer of authority. "You've made quite an impression in 2 weeks," Garrett said quietly as they waited for the ceremony to begin. "I've been getting reports from my successor about the unconventional new commander at Artemis. Some of the descriptions have been colorful." "I imagine so," Irene replied with a slight smile. Did the reports mention that operational efficiency has improved by 12% in that same 2 weeks? Garrett raised an eyebrow. They didn't, actually. They focus more on your age and your methods than your results, which tells you something about what people notice versus what they should notice. The ceremony proceeded with full military formality. Garrett delivered remarks praising the base personnel and highlighting operational achievements during his tenure. When Irene stepped forward to speak, she could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes assessing her, measuring her against their expectations and assumptions. Admiral Garrett has left me with a well-organized, highly capable installation, Irene began, her voice carrying clearly across the parade ground. But more importantly, he's left me with something that can't be measured in readiness reports or efficiency metrics. He's left me with personnel who care deeply about their mission and their shipmates. She paused, looking out at the assembled faces. Over the past 2 weeks, I've had the privilege of observing this base in operation. I've seen engineers solving complex problems with innovative solutions. I've watched security personnel maintaining vigilance with professionalism and dedication. I've witnessed junior officers and enlisted personnel demonstrating expertise that often exceeds their rank or years of service. In the crowd, Torres stood at attention, remembering his first encounter with the woman he'd assumed was a lost recruit. Beside him, other personnel who'd interacted with Admiral Hill during her observation week listened with new appreciation. I've also observed something less positive, Irene continued, her tone shifting. I've seen talented people overlooked because they don't fit traditional expectations of what competence looks like. I've watched good ideas dismissed because they came from unexpected sources. I've noticed that we sometimes value appearance and conformity over capability and innovation. The crowd shifted slightly, a ripple of discomfort moving through the assembled personnel. This wasn't the typical change of command speech, full of platitudes and promises. Those patterns end today, Irene said firmly. Under my command, Naval Base Artemis will be a place where merit matters more than assumptions, where the best idea wins regardless of whose idea it is, and where every person serving here has the opportunity to contribute at the full extent of their capabilities. She let the words hang for a moment before continuing in a lighter tone. This doesn't mean chaos or the abandonment of military discipline. It means being disciplined about what actually matters. Mission success, operational effectiveness, and the well-being of the personnel who make both possible. It means being willing to question our assumptions, including my own, when questioning leads to better outcomes. The formal transfer of command took place, the base flag passing from Garrett to Irene with full ceremonial precision. As Irene accepted command authority, she caught sight of Chief Walsh in the crowd. The veteran CPO's expression was thoughtful rather than skeptical, a significant shift from 2 weeks earlier. After the ceremony, during the reception for visiting dignitaries, Irene found herself surrounded by well-wishers and curious observers. A visiting admiral from the Allied Portuguese Navy approached with a question that others had clearly been thinking but not asking. "Admiral Hill," he said in accented but fluent English, "you are quite young for such command responsibility. How do you handle the skepticism that surely must come with that?" Irene smiled, appreciating the directness of the question. "I handle it by proving that youth and capability aren't mutually exclusive, and by remembering that skepticism isn't inherently negative. It's a request for proof, and I'm happy to provide that proof through results rather than rhetoric." The weeks following the change of command ceremony brought both validation and new challenges for Irene's leadership approach. The modified planning protocols had proven their value, but implementing broader cultural change across an entire base was a slower, more complex process than adjusting specific procedures. In early May, a situation arose that would test whether the changes Irene had initiated were merely superficial compliance or genuine shifts in organizational culture. A routine equipment inspection revealed significant corrosion in the steering mechanism of one of the destroyers, damage severe enough to require extensive repairs that would take the vessel out of operation for at least 6 weeks. The discovery came during a morning briefing that Irene attended as part of her regular schedule of operational oversight. Lieutenant Commander Rutherford presented the findings with obvious frustration. The corrosion should have been caught during the quarterly inspection 3 months ago, Rutherford explained, displaying detailed photographs of the damage. But the inspection was rushed due to scheduling pressures, and the severity wasn't recognized until now. We're looking at significant repair costs and operational disruption. The room fell silent, personnel waiting to see how Admiral Hill would react to what was essentially a failure in maintenance oversight. Under previous commanders, such situations typically led to investigations focused on assigning blame and protecting reputations rather than solving problems. Irene studied the photographs carefully, then asked, "Who was responsible for the original inspection?" "Petty Officer Second Class Thomas Brennan," Rutherford said, and Irene noticed he didn't add any editorial commentary about the failure. "Have him join us," Irene said. "I want to hear directly what happened." 15 minutes later, Petty Officer Brennan stood in the conference room, visibly nervous about being summoned to a senior staff meeting. He was young, probably mid-20s, with the kind of rigid posture that suggested he expected punishment. "Petty Officer Brennan," Irene began, "Lieutenant Commander Rutherford tells me you conducted the inspection where this corrosion should have been identified. I want to understand what happened, not to assign blame, but to prevent similar oversights in the future. Tell me about the conditions under which you performed that inspection." Brennan glanced at Rutherford, who nodded encouragingly. "Ma'am, I was given 4 hours to complete an inspection that typically requires 8 to 10 hours of thorough examination. We were behind schedule due to a previous maintenance delay, and I was told that the vessel needed to be cleared for operational duty by end of day." "Who gave you that timeline?" Irene asked. "It came down from the Operations Center, ma'am. Priority tasking for an upcoming exercise." Irene turned to Commander Pierce, who oversaw operation scheduling. "Commander, do you recall this situation?" Pierce's expression was troubled. "I do, Admiral. We were facing pressure to meet training commitments with Allied forces. In retrospect, we prioritized schedule over thoroughness, which was a mistake in judgment." "It was an understandable mistake given competing pressures," Irene said. "But it's also exactly the kind of mistake that my modified planning protocols are designed to prevent. When we face competing priorities, we need better systems for evaluating trade-offs rather than just defaulting to schedule pressures." She turned back to Brennan. "Petty Officer, in your professional judgment, if you'd had adequate time, would you have identified this corrosion?" "Yes, ma'am," Brennan said without hesitation. "The damage is in an area that requires partial disassembly to inspect properly. With adequate time, I would have completed that disassembly and identified the problem." "Then this isn't a failure of your competence or diligence," Irene said firmly. "This is a systems failure where schedule pressures overrode safety and maintenance protocols. That's on leadership, not on you." The relief on Brennan's face was palpable, but Irene wasn't finished. She turned to address the entire room. "Here's what we're going to do. First, Commander Pierce and Lieutenant Commander Rutherford will jointly develop new protocols for maintenance scheduling that include built-in buffers and escalation procedures when timeline pressures threaten inspection quality. Second, we're going to conduct a review of all recent inspections performed under similar time constraints to identify any other potential oversights. Third, and most importantly, we're going to create a reporting system where personnel can flag situations where they feel pressured to compromise safety or thoroughness for schedule compliance." She paused, making eye contact with the assembled officers. "I want to be absolutely clear about something. In this command, bringing problems to light is rewarded, not punished. Petty Officer Brennan could have stayed quiet about the timeline pressures and let the blame fall entirely on his shoulders. Instead, he was honest about the circumstances, which gives us the information we need to fix the actual problem." The corrosion incident became a turning point in how Naval Base Artemis approached operational challenges. Word spread quickly about how Admiral Hill had handled the situation, focusing on systemic problems rather than individual blame. The response resonated particularly with junior personnel who'd spent years watching colleagues take the fall for failures that originated higher up the chain of command. Petty Officer Brennan found himself unexpectedly celebrated among his peers, not for the inspection failure, but for his honest accounting of the circumstances. Other personnel began speaking up about similar situations where schedule pressures had compromised their ability to perform duties properly. The reports weren't complaints, they were data points that Admiral Hill collected and analyzed to identify patterns in how the base allocated resources and set priorities. Within 3 weeks, the new maintenance scheduling protocols were implemented across all departments. The changes added an average of 15% more time to inspection and maintenance procedures, but the quality of work improved dramatically. More importantly, personnel reported feeling supported rather than pressured, trusted rather than blamed. Chief Walsh, who'd been among the most vocal skeptics of Admiral Hill's leadership approach, found himself reassessing his position during a conversation with Torres in the security office. "I've been thinking about what happened with the Brennan situation," Walsh admitted, reviewing security logs on his computer. "Under Admiral Garrett, that kid would have been written up, possibly facing disciplinary action. His career would have taken a hit because he was put in an impossible situation by people above his pay grade." Torres nodded, remembering his own encounter with Admiral Hill on her first day. She has a way of seeing past the surface of situations to understand what's actually going on. When she confronted me about my assumptions that first morning, she could have made it about my failure. Instead, she made it about the systemic thinking that led to my failure. "It's disconcerting," Walsh said with a slight smile. "I've spent 25 years learning to operate within a certain kind of command structure. Now we've got a commander who's rewriting the rules, and I'm realizing that some of those old rules weren't serving us as well as I thought they were." The cultural shift at Naval Base Artemis became evident during a surprise inspection by the Naval Forces Command in late May. The inspection team arrived expecting the usual carefully choreographed demonstrations of readiness and competence. Instead, they found an installation that operated with unusual transparency and honest self-assessment. When inspectors asked about recent operational challenges, personnel didn't deflect or minimize problems. They spoke candidly about the corrosion incident, the scheduling pressure issues that had been identified and corrected, and the ongoing process of improving coordination between departments. The honesty was startling enough that the lead inspector requested a private meeting with Admiral Hill. Captain Regina Foster, who'd conducted base inspections for 8 years, sat across from Irene in the Admiral's office with an expression of professional curiosity. "Admiral Hill, I have to say that your personnel's approach to this inspection has been highly unusual. Most installations present their best face forward and minimize discussion of problems or failures. Most installations prioritize looking good over being good." Irene replied, "I'd rather have an accurate understanding of our capabilities and limitations than a polished fiction that falls apart under real operational stress." Foster consulted her notes, a slight smile playing at her lips. "Your approach seems to be working. We've identified fewer actual deficiencies here than at any installation I've inspected in the past 2 years. The problems you have are well understood and actively being addressed. That's remarkably rare. It's what happens when people feel safe being honest about challenges instead of hiding them to protect themselves," Irene said. "Fear-based command structures produce compliance and concealment. Trust-based structures produce collaboration and continuous improvement." The inspection team's final report praised Naval Base Artemis for operational effectiveness, personnel readiness, and what they termed exemplary cultural practices that promote honest assessment and rapid problem resolution. The report was circulated throughout Naval Forces Command, drawing attention to Admiral Hill's unconventional but highly effective leadership approach. In June, Irene received orders to attend a Naval Forces Command Leadership Conference, where she'd be presenting her methods to other installation commanders. The invitation came with a personal note from the Vice Admiral overseeing naval operations, acknowledging that her approach was generating significant interest across the service. The night before she was scheduled to leave for the conference, Irene stood on the observation deck, overlooking the harbor, watching the destroyers at their moorings. The base that had greeted her with skepticism and doubt 3 months ago had transformed into something more functional, more honest, and ultimately more effective. Torres found her there, conducting his evening security rounds. "Big day tomorrow, ma'am," presenting to the senior leadership. "Big day," Irene agreed, "though I suspect some of those senior leaders will be as skeptical as this base was when I arrived." Old patterns die hard, especially at higher command levels. Then you'll do what you did here, Torres said confidently. You'll prove that the patterns need to die because better ones exist. The Naval Forces Command Leadership Conference took place at the headquarters complex, a sprawling facility that housed the senior officers who directed naval operations across multiple theaters. Irene arrived to find herself among installation commanders who averaged 20 years more experience than her, most of whom viewed her invitation to present as either a political gesture toward youth representation or a concerning sign that Naval Command was embracing unproven methodologies. Her presentation was scheduled for the second day of the conference, following more traditional briefings on resource allocation and strategic readiness. When Irene took the stage, she could read the skepticism in the room, the same expression she'd faced 3 months earlier at Naval Base Artemis, but multiplied across dozens of senior officers. I'm here to talk about a simple premise, Irene began, pulling up her first slide. The best ideas don't always come from the most senior voices in the room, and organizational effectiveness suffers when we let rank and seniority override merit and capability. She walked through the changes implemented at Artemis, backing each assertion with data, operational improvements, and honest acknowledgement of what hadn't worked as planned. She talked about the corrosion incident, about Petty Officer Brennan, and about how blame-focused leadership created cultures of concealment rather than improvement. The questions that followed were sharp, sometimes bordering on hostile. One commander asked whether her methods undermined military discipline. Another suggested that her approach worked only because of the unique characteristics of her base. A third questioned whether someone with her limited experience should be advocating for such significant changes to established command practices. Irene answered each, questioned with the same combination of data and principle that had gradually won over the skeptics at Artemis. She acknowledged limitations, provided evidence, and consistently returned to the core argument. Military effectiveness required creating environments where capability mattered more than conformity to traditional expectations. By the end of her presentation, the room's atmosphere had shifted. Not everyone was convinced. Institutional resistance ran deep, but enough senior officers saw the value in her approach that serious conversations began about pilot programs at other installations. 3 weeks later, back at Naval Base Artemis, Irene received word that 2 other installation commanders had requested consultations about implementing similar protocols at their bases. The request came with authorization from Naval Command to develop formal guidance for what was being termed the Artemis model of command leadership. On a warm July evening, Irene gathered her senior staff for an informal session at the base recreation center. The meeting wasn't about official business. It was about acknowledging how far they'd come in 4 months and discussing where they wanted to go next. When I arrived here, Irene said to the assembled officers and senior enlisted personnel, "Most of you thought I was too young, too inexperienced, or too unconventional to command this installation effectively. Those weren't unreasonable concerns. They were honest assessments based on traditional markers of readiness for command." She looked around the room at faces that had become familiar, at people who'd evolved from skeptics to collaborators. What we've proven together is that effectiveness isn't determined by age or traditional career trajectories. It's determined by willingness to question assumptions, including our own. It's determined by creating environments where the best ideas surface regardless of their source. And it's determined by measuring success through actual outcomes rather than comfort with familiar approaches. Chief Walsh raised his hand, a gesture that would have been unthinkable in the rigid hierarchy that existed 4 months earlier. "Admiral, I think I speak for most of us when I say that we were wrong about you. Not just wrong in our initial assessment, but wrong in the way we formed that assessment. We looked at surface characteristics instead of capability, and that limited both you and us." "Which is exactly the bias I'm trying to address throughout naval operations," Irene replied. "Not because I want to prove people wrong about me specifically, but because every installation has talented people being overlooked for the same reasons. Every command has solutions that never surface because they come from unexpected sources. We can be better than that, and Artemis has proven it's possible." The conversation continued late into the evening, moving from reflection to planning as the group discussed how to maintain the cultural changes they'd implemented. There was acknowledgement that constant vigilance would be necessary, that old patterns could easily reassert themselves without deliberate effort to maintain new approaches. As the gathering wound down, Torres approached Irene with something approaching a smile. "You know, Admiral, when I confronted you that first morning, I was absolutely certain you didn't belong in that restricted area. I was so convinced, by my own assumptions, that I couldn't see what was right in front of me. And now?" Irene asked. "Now, I'm grateful that I was wrong," Torres replied, "because being wrong led to learning something important, not just about you, but about how I evaluate people and situations. That lesson has made me better at my job and better at understanding what real competence looks like." Irene looked out at the base spreading before them, at an installation that had transformed from skeptical to supportive, from rigid to adaptive, from focused on appearances to focused on effectiveness. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had proven something she'd believed for years, that the military's greatest strength wasn't its weapons or its tactics, but its people and their willingness to evolve when given the chance. The soldier who'd been confronted as the wrong rookie had proven to be exactly the right admiral for a base that needed to learn that assumptions about capability were often just limitations waiting to be overcome. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.